We're in this series. This is week 3 of our series. What was I thinking? And it's not just that you have bad thoughts sometimes. The question that we've addressed here is, what do you think about God? What do you think about God? Because that's the most important thing. And in week 1 of our studies, we talked about the fact that sometimes we don't think God's that powerful because we have some power, but not much. We're often not helpless, but we're powerless. But God is more powerful than we think. And that's the whole idea. That was week 1. But sometimes we forget that God's more powerful. And then last week we talked about the fact that God, he's always photobombing us. He's always in the camera view of our lives. Actually, we're in his camera view, but we're always in the camera view with shot with God, and he's more present than we often think. And that's the whole idea. This week we're going to talk about the fact that God is more active. And the idea here is this guy named Asa, and let me just recap real quick who we're talking about. Asa was a king of Judah. Now, if you don't understand the history there, go way back to Israel. They're founded, the father of Israel is a guy named Jacob, who get his name changed to Israel. He has 12 sons who become the 12 tribes. And those 12 tribes are brothers. They have lots of kids. I mean, just kids everywhere. And down the road, they became a nation. And they're united under a king named David, who grows them to be the world power of the day. And then he gets a chance to rest and turn the kingdom over to his son Solomon. Solomon brings it up to the wealthiest nation on the planet. And then he turns it over to his son, who's a dodo. And that's a Hebrew word for being dumb. Dodo, you can say it with me, dodo. But it's not really, I just made that up. So that's what they call just preaching, you know. But he was, and Rehoboam didn't do what was wise, and he ends up splitting it. Civil war, and you talk about a civil war. This civil war is going to last for hundreds of years. In fact, to be honest with you, they've never really reconciled that civil war. Because Israel, the top 10 tribes who became the nation of Israel, they actually went into captivity. The bottom half, though, is what we're talking about. They were actually 2 tribes named Judah and Benjamin. They just called themselves Judah. They still had Jerusalem as their capital, and they were the ones who, their kings were all ancestors of David, because that was a promise God had given them, until they become captives of the Babylonians, and that was a problem there. But we're still way up. In fact, we're going to talk about Asa. He's the great-great-grandson of David. And Asa has been a pretty good king. At least he started off pretty good. And that's what we talked about in week 1. But what happens and what do we think about God when you face uncontrollable circumstances in your life? And this seems to be a topic that is all throughout the Bible, but it really is true. What do you think about God when you face a circumstance in your life that you can't control? And the problem is, whether you want to admit it or not, we all think we have control. In fact, we all like to practice our plans and make plans, and some of us are so obsessive about it. But you know, the truth of the matter is, it's an illusion. We don't really control anything. And the truth is, when our plans go sideways, some of us, and we're not going to name names today, but some of us, we get upset. Your preacher does. We get upset, and we get mad, and we get angry, and we think the whole world's going to end because our plans didn't work out the way we want them to. And the truth of the matter is, we had no control. And when we get into those circumstances, the question we're going to ask is, where was God? What's he doing? And sometimes these, you know, it's no big deal when you just have a little event that gets canceled or changed, or maybe it's your vacation plans that get a little rearranged, or maybe it was COVID that put you off a little bit. But when it's big time situations where you struggle with circumstances that are way out of control, someone's sick to the point of death, or someone does die, those are circumstances you face, or you lose a job, or you get evicted, or you lose your health, something along those lines, and you're sitting back going, what in the world? And what you think about God is so vitally important, and that's where we face today with a guy named Asa, who's this king. And remember, his story is, back when he first takes over the king, the role of being king from his dad, who his dad wasn't a good king, he takes over this role, and he's a good king. And right away, he's faced with a dilemma, and we talked about this in week 1. He faces this army that comes up against him that is a 1,000,000 man army with the state-of-the-art biggest weapons of the day, which were chariots of iron. And he had a 580,000 man army himself, but they didn't have chariots. And that's a big advantage. And yet, you think about it, it was a 2-to-1 army. And what he does is so profound in week 1, he turns, and we realize that he turned to God, and he prays and asks God for help, and God honors that request and helps him defeat they crush the army, and not only does he defeat them, but he gives them all the plunder. He gives them all the treasure. They come back wealthy, rich, and that's just an amazing thing. And they're celebrating, and everything's going great. And we saw in week 2 that God's presence was there, and they kept noticing it. But what we found out in this story is that in his later days, after he's been king for a long time, after things have been going well, he forgets God. He forgets God's more powerful, forgets God's more present, and he starts thinking less of God. And because of that, because he doesn't think about God, things turn on him. And that's where we're going to pick up the story today, because we're in some of the verses we've already read before, but I want you to know it's important to understand what we think about God, because there are so many different factors in our lives that change how we feel about God. And that's the truth. And our feelings will lie to us, and that's where you can't depend on them. So if you have your Bibles, we're going to be in 2 Chronicles, and chapter number 16, we're going to pick up the end story of this guy named King Asa. And we've read some of this before, so it may sound familiar. I'm not going to read every verse for time's sake, because we got a lot to cover today. But it says in verse number 1 of chapter 16 of 2 Chronicles, in the 36th year of Asa's reign. Now, we just jumped from year 1, where he faces a 1,000,000-man army against him, to year 36. He's been doing it. He's a seasoned veteran. And things have been so good. He hasn't had one struggle for 35 years. 35 years of nothing but prosperity. He's had success. He's been a great king. He's built up the economy. He's built up all the cities. He's built up the defenses. But in year 36, God sends a problem his way once again to see what he would do. Because you know what? Sometimes we forget that God's there. We forget about his presence. We forget about his power. But more so today, we forget about his activity. And it says in the 36th year of Asa's reign, Baasha, king of Israel, went up against Judah. Now, remember I said they were split. This is Civil War stuff. So they're fighting, and this is a battle that's going to go on for generations and generations until finally the Assyrians come and tote Israel off. But this struggle was such a profound struggle. And you think about Civil War. Civil War is something that really a lot of us identify with in our country, because it was such a huge war. And you think about the span of it. It didn't even last that long compared to theirs. Theirs is going to last hundreds of years. Ours lasted less than 10, when you think about it. And it destroyed our nation. This is an ongoing battle that's just going to cause all kinds of problems. And so Asa, what would we tell Asa? Asa, he would say, you know what? I remember going to battle. I remember the battle in my first years of my life. I remember, as king, I remember this battle with a 1,000,000-man army. And this guy, Baasha's got an army, but it's not a 1,000,000 men. And he doesn't have chariots. It's not that scary. In fact, we know some of these guys we're fighting against. And I know they can't shoot worth a lick. I know some of them, their moms taught them how to shoot, or their dads taught them, I don't know. You know, they're talking trash to each other. You get the idea there? But, and really, you think by now, Asa, he's gotten wise. Because don't we consider age wisdom? Don't we? But sometimes it's not true, is it now? Uh-oh. I know that's insulting to all of us that are getting older. But it's true. Because Asa, in all of his years of wisdom, all of his years of sitting under God's power, forgot that God was active in his life. And it says, if we go on to the next verse, it says in verse number 2, I know I'm skipping a little bit here, but I want to get the main points here. So what did Asa do? He didn't pray, he paid. And then Asa took the silver and gold out of the treasury of the Lord's temple and his own palace. He's giving his own stuff. So what is he doing? He's gotten to the point, and well, let's keep going. Verse number 3, or it finishes off verse 2, and sent it to Ben-Hadad, king of Aram. Now, Aram, if you're like, what is Aram? That's Syria. Just another term for Syrian. The Armenians, the Syrians, same people. Ben-Hadad was a thorn in the side of Israel and Judah, because he kept invading all this time. Now, under David had conquered the nation of Aram, or Syria, and they had become his servants and his friends because he was more powerful. But since they have had this squabble and split the country, the Syrians are like, hey, we can take them, and they've been a problem. Ben-Hadad's been one of those guys who's been raiding. He's been problematic, and right now, he actually, at this point in history, has an agreement with the king of Israel, Baasha, the guy who's invading. He's got that kind of agreement going on. Asa's sitting back going, wait a minute, I got to figure out something to do. So he takes all the gold and silver of the house of God and his own, and he sends it to this guy. And look what he says in verse number 3. It says, this is what he said: let there be a treaty. between me and you. It goes on to say, break your treaty with Baasha, king of Israel. So it's basically like his solution to the problem of an invader is hire somebody else to fix it, right? Now, most of us would say, that is so smart. Wouldn't we? We talked about this in week 1. Hey, this is so smart. I don't have to do the work. He can do the work. Is that what God thought? Probably not. And here's the problem. This is the first half of our statement that we want to deal with today. God is always working even when we are not. And what we see here, and I want you to get this in your mind, because this is so important how we respond to things. God is always working even when we are not. What does that mean? 35 years since the last battle, and you know who's sitting on his throne not doing anything? It's not God. It's Asa. See, Asa believed that God's not working because there's an invader, but the truth of the matter is God is always working. And if you don't get anything else out of today, man, you better get this principle that God is always working. And that's an important aspect of our lives. God is always active. He's always working. And Asa forgot that. So when it came down to it, Asa's like, I'm comfortable, you're comfortable, we ought not to do anything. And that's the state of Christianity in the 21st century. We ought to not do anything. Let's just sit on our holy behinds. Let's pay somebody else to do it. Let's pay the preacher to do it. Hey, you know what a lot of churches do that? They expect the preacher to go out and do all the visiting, all the witnessing, hey, do it all, preacher. Is that the way it's supposed to be? Not at all, because God's active and he expects us to join him in his work, and that's what we're going to find out in a minute. Asa forgot this. Asa forgot his calling by God was for him to sit on a throne and do the work of God with God, to follow God. That was his calling. And Asa says, no. It'd be far easier if I take money, my resources, and just throw some money at the situation, right? Isn't that how Americans deal with it? Let's throw some money at the situation and make it go away. So he pays off Ben-Hadad, thinking, I've solved the problem. And it made it easy because Asa basically doesn't have to do anything, right? Because if you don't understand what he's doing here, Baasha's invading. He's coming into Judah. And so I'm going to pay Ben-Hadad all my money, and I'm going to make a pact with him, and he's going to start coming after Israel, so Israel's going to stop coming after me, and I don't have to do anything. But the truth of the matter is God is always working even when we're not, and that's the problem. So we pick up the story, skip down verse number 7. It says this. Now, in verse number 7, we've read this before. Hananiah the seer, or the prophet, has come along, and this is the words that he gives to Asa. He's speaking directly God's word to him. He says, because you relied. Is that really an active or passive thing? That's really, you relied, that's sort of passive because you don't have to do any action, do you? You didn't get up and pray. You just relied. You let somebody else do it is what he's saying. That's a passive term. He says, because you relied on somebody else to take care of this problem, because you relied on the king of Aram, Ben-Hadad, and not the Lord your God, that's the guy you should be working with. That's who he says, and there's the problem right there. He keeps going, and he says, hey, you know what? Because you did that, you relied. Verse number 8, he says, yet when you relied on the Lord, he delivered them in your hand. He's showing this contrast because he wants to get the point across. Actively pursuing things with God. That's what the whole idea. We should be active because God is always active. That's the point. We go on to the next verse. He says in verse number 9, for the eyes of the Lord, look what the eyes of the Lord are doing. They range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. God is always active. Do you get what he's saying there? God's always active even when we're not. And then he looks at him and says, you've done, this is sort of insulting, because you realize he's talking to the king. And he says, king, you've done a foolish thing. The only thing you have done is stupid. And we're good at that, aren't we? He says, you've done a foolish thing, and because you've sat on your behind and not done what you're supposed to do, here's what's going to happen. From now on, all that peace and prosperity you had, from now on, all the stuff that went right in your life, it's not going to go right anymore. From now on, you're going to be at war. You're going to be at war. Hey, you know what? You've had the chance to do what God was doing and join in with his activity, but you didn't. And so God's going to make you active whether you wanted to or not, because he's going to put you at war all the time. We skip down to the next verse. Verse number 10, it says, Asa, what did he do? When he's told this, and this is so important we see this, he humbled himself and he cried and said, God, forgive me, didn't he? Not at all. Asa, when he heard this, he got angry. And isn't that the reaction we have? Sometimes when we hear the truth, We don't like the truth. Hurts. God, I've been doing all this great stuff, and you said I'm not doing anything? Asa was angry, and he was angry with the man of God when he probably should have been angry with himself, or at least take it directly. If you're gonna not be a coward, take it to God. But he didn't do that. In fact, it says he was so enraged that he put him, that is the seer, Hananiah the seer, in prison. By the way, during this time period, it was not good to be a prophet. It was not. Most of the guys didn't end well. They got killed. It says at the same time, and I love this because it's showing you the thinking behind Asa. Because Asa, we saw this great man who's praying and he's had the victories for all these years. All of a sudden his experience failed him. He puts the guy who has God's word in prison, and at the same time he brutally oppressed some of the people. Some of the people. Skips down to verse number 12, and I wanted you to see the finish of Asa's life. It says, in the 39th year, so we just jumped from year 36 to year 39. In the 39th year of his reign, Asa was afflicted with a disease in his feet. Not sure exactly what it was. Could have been a lot of different things, but it was a disease. It was something serious. In fact, it keeps on, it says, though this disease was severe, even in his illness, and this is so hard-hearted he is, even in Asa's illness, he didn't seek help from God, from the Lord. He didn't seek help from the Lord. How stubborn are we? Or yet, in the thought I'm giving you today, how inactive was he? How inactive was he? Hey, you know what we need to do? We need to get more active with God, not get mad at God and say, you know what? I don't care. I'm not doing it. And in his own illness, as severe as it was, the only hope he had was to turn to the great physician, the great God of the universe, and say, God, you're active. I want to join in you. But he didn't do that. He only went to the physicians, is what it says there. And so what happens? Verse 13, it says, then in his 41st year, 5 years down from when he ends up with that conflict. Remember 5 years? It was in his 36th year that he had the conflict with Israel. In year 41 of his reign, Asa died. And he rested with his ancestors. And you know what he died of? You're going to say, foot problem. No, he died of inactivity. He forgot that God was active even when we're not. And you know what he should have realized? That God invites us, and God invites you to join him in his work. That's the rest of it. See, Asa, you are called to be a king. Your family was set to be on the throne. You had a special privilege above all other people. You are of the house and lineage of David. Your ancestor is going to be the Messiah. What a great privilege. I want you to be part of my team. Can you imagine that? Do you realize when you joined on to be one of God's sons and daughters, to be a member of his body, the church, you know what? He's inviting you not to sit on your pew all year, but to get up and get active. He's inviting you to join him in this work, and what greater work could you have? You know, as men, we define ourselves by what we do. I heard this morning at men's breakfast various conversations, and it's always amazing to me. It always goes back to one of two things, either recreation, one of three things, recreation, work, or bathroom. Those three things always come up with men's conversations. I don't know why the bathroom thing always comes up, but it does. That's just true. So ladies, if you don't know that now. Guys always goes back to one of those three things. But it's amazing. We forget that the greatest calling we have in our life is what God invites us to do. It's what God has called us to do. It's what we talked about in Sunday school. God has called us to be ambassadors, to join in the work of Jesus Christ. Do you realize the Messiah who died on the cross for our sins, the only perfect person to ever walk this planet, has invited you to join him to do the work of God? Thank you, Dwight. The rest of us, we're not so excited about it, are we? Because we got a lot of Asa in us. Because it's a whole lot easier to sit on our holy behinds and do nothing. I like my rest. I like my money. I like my peace. I like my safety. And what ruffles us up is when the politics or the economy or something like that doesn't go our way. That's when you see the people of God getting upset. And isn't that a shame? Because that's what God called us to. He invites us to join him in his work because that's what he wants us to do. In fact, I would say this, the way we handle ourselves when the circumstances get out of our control, it directly is connected to the way we focus in life. It really is. You see, when we focus on the right things, that helps us maintain our peace. And we talked about that peace last week, right? The peace that passes all understanding. It's when we understand the presence of God, that focus. But when we focus on the wrong things, you know what happens? When you start focusing on the wrong things, it builds up stress in your life, more and more stress. And there's three issues that we can have here, and I want to talk about in this short time today, that we can either look out, look up, or look out, look in, or look up, and that's the whole idea here. Those are the three choices you have, and you can see it. First of all, I talk about looking out. A lot of us, when we go to this issue of looking out, we tend to focus on the circumstances of our lives. You could see this happening during COVID. In fact, it's still a lot of people, and the media helps us with this, it does. Because at the very mention of COVID, we start looking around like, who's coughing? Who coughed in here? Who sneezed? You know, Kathy was talking about one of her relatives had COVID, and I said, yeah, tell him he can keep it. I don't want it. But it's okay to laugh about some of this stuff, but the truth of the matter is we had an obsession, an unhealthy obsession with COVID. We locked ourselves in our homes. We were scared to go out. We were scared to talk to people. Do you ever realize that might be something that would be a problem for God? Because you can't be witnesses when you're locked in your home, scared of everything. Who wins in that one? Asa, Satan. Hey, because we don't believe God's active. God's not active because he gave us COVID, and that's why we have to sit in our homes, locked up. Do you hear what I'm saying, people? It's true. And when we look out and we focus on the circumstances of our life, that things are spinning out of control because we are trying to control them, but we can't, what the danger is that we focus on the problem so much that it keeps our focus on these problems. And it doesn't allow us to, we see more and more what's wrong, but we don't come up with a solution because it just keeps us focusing on the problem. And that's where every day when you turn on the news and you heard, oh my goodness, there's more people that died of COVID, there's more people that died of COVID, there's more people that died of COVID. Hey, you know what? Those people were dying and going to hell too. That's what we didn't put together, did it? We just concerned ourselves with people dying and it might happen to me. I don't want the circumstances to hit me and my family, so I'd rather not talk to anybody. It's true. We looked out and saw the circumstances, but that's not what God calls us to do. The second aspect is to look in. And when you look in, you start to focus on yourself. That's the problem there. When you focus on self, the danger there is that you realize there's nothing you can do to gain control of the situation when you focus on yourself. It helps us develop that stress issue. What is stress? Let me give you a definition of stress here I think is really good. Stress is a fearful concern experienced when life's demands seem greater than my ability to meet them. And that's the problem. Now, when you sit there and read that, and some of you, like I have to read things a couple times before it really sinks in what it's saying. So read that a couple times. He's not going to change screens that quickly. When you realize what that says, you know what you're going to realize? That you can't meet hardly any of the life's problems. And you're always going to have stress if you look to yourself. And that's where stress comes from. See, the stress of my life, the things I worry about, the anxieties, remember we talked about that last week, where God said, hey, if you just focus on my presence, you won't have these issues as much. Well, we've got to realize that's because we're focused on us. It really is. And in a minute, I'm going to show you an example of how this all works. But our third option to cut the stress, to cut all the problems is not to look out, not to look in, but to look up, to focus on God. That's what God calls us to. See, we focus on the only one who has the resources to cause the problems to go away. And that's the whole magic of it. So I told you I was going to give you the example that goes with this. So if you have your Bibles, turn over to Mark in chapter number 4. Mark chapter 4, this is a story, probably you've heard it before if you've been to church or any length of time. Pretty famous story. Mark chapter 4, Jesus and the disciples, he tells them to get in the boat. We're going to go to the other side. They get in the boat, and we pick up in verse 37. It says, a furious squall. Weird word, but if you don't know what squall is, it's a storm, okay? A furious squall, okay? Furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Nothing more scary to be in a boat in the middle of somewhere that's pretty deep, even if you swim. By the way, does it help you very much if you're in the middle of the ocean and your boat goes under, if you can swim real good? I'm telling you, you'd have to be the world's best swimmer ever to be able to survive. And I don't think I could do that. Plus, you talk about all the things that are underneath you that you don't see. That's just scary to me. They're in a lake that's not that big, but it is damaging, and the boat is becoming overflowed. These guys, and you got to picture this, some of these guys made a living out of being in a boat. and they're still having problems. This is a severe storm. It's a supernatural storm, I would say, because it's going to test their faith and see where their focus is. We go on to the next verse, verse number 38. It says, Jesus, just so you know, and this is the most important part of it. I know I didn't highlight it, but this is the most important part. Jesus was in the stern. For us land lovers, stern means back, okay? He was in the back of the boat. But he was sleeping on a cushion, which makes no sense there. How do you sleep in the middle of a storm? I'm not one of those guys who can sleep just anywhere, especially if there's loud noises and all kinds of commotion. Evidently, Jesus was, or he was really tired, or he was just trying to prove a point. One of those three things is happening. But it says the disciples woke him up and said to him, and you got to hear their voice, "Teacher, Rabbi, Master, don't you care?" That's a pretty hard accusation, right? Don't you care? Wow. Don't we do that sometimes? Something bad happens, a circumstance out of our control. The first thing we do is, God, what were you thinking? Are you just not intelligent? Are you just not God? Because this is the hoax that we're being told about who God is in our society today. That God doesn't care, that God created you and left you alone, or there's no God at all. And you're just simple-minded and you believe it. And the truth of the matter is, we often, when we get in the middle of a problem that is too big for us, the stress of our life causes us to lose our focus. And what do we say? Don't you care? God, don't you care if I drown? Don't you care if I have COVID? Don't you care if I die? Don't you care if I have disease? Don't you care if I lost my job? Don't you care if I'm not married? Don't you care? Don't you care? Don't you care? And we cry. We cry like little children, don't we? That's what they're doing. In verse 39, it says, he got up. He wasn't that. I think he was just faking. You know what I'm saying? Because he's sound asleep and they're yelling. He just gets up. He rebuked the wind. He said to the waves, quiet. Quiet. Who talks to waves and wind like this? Quiet, be still. And then the wind died down. And hey, can you imagine? Okay, I just gave you what the disciples are saying. And then he gets up without saying a word to them and says, wind, be quiet. Waves, stop. And they did. And you think that was, nothing's moving. There's not a fish swimming near that boat. There's not a wind. There's nothing. And the disciples, I think they were holding their breath. Because they're scared. I'll show you in a minute. It says that. Verse 40, it goes on to say this. He said to his disciples, notice what he says to his disciples. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? In verse 41, it says this. They were terrified. That's why I think they were holding their breath. They were terrified. And they asked each other, this is the whispers. You know, people always whisper because they don't want the teacher to hear. Who is this? Who is this? We haven't got a clue who he is. Who is this guy? Even the wind and the waves obey him. And the truth of the matter is, when they were asking God, in verse 38, when they said, hey, don't you care if we drown? You know what they were really saying? Can't you see how this circumstance, how this situation affects me? Isn't that what we said during COVID? I just wish things were the way it used to be. How many times did we say that? And you know what we were doing? Focusing on me. And God's saying, I gave you this for a reason. I gave you this for a reason. Stop focusing on you, because the whole point of this story here is a bad focus. You see, what you have to realize is some of the disciples were fishermen. Some of them were seasoned. They'd been through storms similar to this, maybe not quite as bad, but do you imagine the first thing they did was they did everything that a seasoned fisherman, a seasoned boat owner would know to do. Some of them grabbed buckets and started bailing out the water because they knew, hey, if this boat fills up, we're going down. Some of them were throwing stuff over the sides because they know heavy boats sink. They were doing everything. Some of them were trying to get oars out and row, trying to get past the waves. Some of them were like, hey, we need to take down the mast. We got to do whatever we can to save ourselves. And you know what they were doing? They were focusing on the storm, and that's that focus on the outward circumstances that you can't control. Because how ridiculous it is to control a storm. It is. It's so ridiculous to try and control a storm. You don't control storms in your life, and you don't control all the problems that you're going to face in your life. Hey, if you've had cancer, if you've had COVID, if you've had any of these major life events like that, you couldn't control them, so why are you getting so upset about them? Because obviously you've got a Father who loves you, and if he sent it to you, he had a reason, and his reasons are always good, because he's a good Father. The rest of them in the boat, because there are guys in there. There's one guy who's a zealot. There's the other guys that they were tax collectors. They were landlubbers, and they're nervous anyway. You know what they were doing? They're the ones yelling, "Jesus, don't you care if we drown?" And you know what they were thinking about? They were thinking about themselves. Jesus, I'm the most important person in my life. Save me. Why aren't you doing anything? And Jesus stands up and says, "Wind, waves, be quiet, be still." And you know what Jesus was doing? He was saying to the disciples, your focus is all wrong. Stop looking out. Stop looking in. Start looking up. I'm on the boat with you. And if I can lay down and take a nap during this storm, you're probably okay. And let me just tell you this. When Jesus decides to take you to the other side, he will take you to the other side. That's the truth. Because our main thought that we have to get through on this is our circumstances do not shape the way we view God. They don't. Our God shapes the way we view our circumstances. That's what he was trying to get them to understand. Because the whole point of today is the fact that God is more active than we think. And sometimes we sit back and say, God, why is the boat sinking? Why is the church failing? Why is the world getting worse? Why is the president not a Republican or a Democrat or whatever we think it should be? And God's saying, stop worrying about those things. Focus on me. Amos had it right. Amos, the prophet in the Old Testament, he wrote during a time when the country was in bad circumstances. He was a prophet who wrote about things in the midst of famines. He had all kinds of pestilence, plagues, persecution, and he wrote one verse I want to take a look at as we close out today. In Amos chapter 4, verse number 13. This is a great verse if you've never seen it before. He says this, and I highlighted the verbs in this because they're so important. This is really what I'm going to talk about. He, speaking of God, he who forms the mountains, who creates the wind and reveals his thoughts to mankind, who turns dawn into darkness and treads on the heights of the earth, the Lord God Almighty is his name. And that is such a profound verse that he gives us here, because what he's talking about is the very fact that God is active, more active than I think. And when we talk about God's activity, I want to give you three things to think about in God's activities today as we go through to help you realize that God is more active than we think. Number one, according to what Amos says here, God's activity in our lives is powerful. Now, I know we've been talking about God's more powerful, but in this aspect here, you got to look at the 5 verbs. Now, those 5 verbs that I highlighted as we went through before, in the original Hebrew text, because it was written in Hebrew, they are all participles. Now, if you're not an English teacher, you may not, and you may be sitting there like, who cares? But the great thing about a participle, participles are ongoing. So when Amos writes this, he's not saying that God did or does, but God did, does, and will do. Do you get what I'm saying here? He's not finished yet. He's still going. And he uses these 5 words, and the first 2 of them shows how his activity is powerful. He tells us that he forms and creates. In fact, the beginning of this, he's he who forms the mountains and creates the wind. And those 2 words there in the original Hebrew are found in another passage that's so unique to us. It's found over in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, where God talks about forming and creating the universe. And he is the active God of creation. And this active God of creation who's so powerful that he can speak and things come to being. Can you imagine that? He speaks and things come to being. He is, as Amos would tell us, he is powerful in that he is omnipotent. That's that fancy theological term that means he has all power to do everything. That every action of God comes with power. It's born of great power. And that's the amazing thing of God. He is more powerful than we think, but his activity itself, our present and situation included, is actively powerful. You see, when you went through COVID, when you go through all the problems of your life, the circumstances out of control, if you're on a boat and a storm comes up, you know what God's going to be able to do? He's going to be able to say, be quiet, wind, because he's actively powerful. He's actively powerful. The word of God is quick and powerful, is what the author of Hebrews told us. And that activity of God is so powerful in life. And you know what? God invites us to join him in his activity. That's what Asa didn't realize. See, if Asa was here today, he'd say, you know what? I was an idiot. I got mad when I should have said, you know what, God, you're right. I should have relied on you. I should have got up off my throne and bent my knee and said, God, you're more powerful than I know. You're more present than I know. And God, your activity never ceases. And that's the truth, that you can form and create anything you want. Because God, to be honest with you, if you notice that, when we read about Asa, God wasn't finished when he was done lecturing Asa. He was the one who resulted in the disease in Asa's feet, because he's in control of that situation too. You say, well, that's harsh. Hey, you need to realize that God is holy. God is just. God is the God who will judge us too. Sometimes we don't want to hear that, but that's the truth. He is that God. The second thing we find out about God's activity is not that it's just powerful, but it's wise. He says there in that verse in Amos that he says he reveals his thoughts to mankind. And that's the same word that we get the word revelation. And we know revelation means a revealing there. It's the same idea carried on there. But what he's trying to do here, he's trying to help us understand that God reveals to us things that are secrets. It's that word that he speaks the unknown to be made known and to be understood. And that's the truth about it. See, when I look at God's word, I'm like, this is so amazing. I don't know how I miss this all the time. I read through these and I'm like, wow, God is so amazing. He puts these simple truths right there in black and white, and sometimes I just don't pay attention. But God is constantly revealing himself to us. That's what Amos is telling the people. Hey, you can have hope in the midst of famine and persecution, in the midst of all your problems, disease, pestilence, in the midst of all the judgment of God, God is still revealing himself. And God today is still working. He's active, and his activity shows wisdom, the wisdom of God. That's the amazing thing. Number 3, God's activity is not just powerful and wise, but it's also present. I love this because he says in this omnipotent, that is all-powerful God, this omniscient God that's all-knowing, and he knows how to take action through his eternal wisdom, he's also actively present. In verse 13, he says he treads on the heights of the earth. He's in places that we can't go. I don't know, anybody in here climbed any of the highest peaks of the world? I haven't. Closest I came is I came a couple of miles up on, I came a couple of 100 feet up on, sorry, not miles, feet up on Mount Kilimanjaro, which is pretty high. But there's no way I was getting any higher than that. Can you imagine? To God, the Himalayas are nothing. To God, Everest, it's a joke. He walks there every day. That's what Amos is saying here. He treads in places that we can't go. He goes to the bottom of the ocean. He's present everywhere all the time. He treads on the heights of the earth. He's showing us that he's actively present. He talks about not just God's knowledge in being omniscient, not his power in being omnipotent, but his presence being omnipresent. That is, he's everywhere at all times. And we never have to face the circumstances. That's what Amos is trying to help us understand. That's what Asa forgot. You don't have to face the king of Israel by yourself. Disciples, you don't have to face the storm by yourself. You don't have to face the problems alone. You don't have to do these things because God is active in all the world. And when we say that, when he talks about treading the heights of the earth, he's not in some distant place for you either. God's with you at work this week. He's at school with you. He's at your job. He's at every location. And that can be scary when we ignore him. That can be threatening when we just ignored God's presence. But he wants us to be active with him because he's actively working on our behalf. Because the bottom line today, Asa would tell you if he's here today, God is more active than you or I think. And I wish I had picked up on that when I was at a point in my life to change the way I think, because I ignored it and it cost me the rest of my life. Cost me health. Cost me a great activity with God. So what about you? When was the last time you actively thought about what God's doing in your life today? How is your work? Do you separate your work from God? Your school from God, young people? All your activities from God? We tend to do this because the truth of the matter is we think that God's taking a break. But the truth is God doesn't take a break. He's always working, even when we're not. And he invites us to join him in his work.